The US and China, the world's two largest economies, have announced plans for tariffs on each other. But can the two sides negotiate a deal before a full-blown trade war possibly be triggered? And this year's Shanghai Cooperation Summit will be held in Qingdao in China in June. How will China and Russia cooperate to help improve regional security? Welcome to The Point. I'm Liu Xin. U.S. President Donald Trump has announced the plan to slap tariffs on Chinese imports of some 60 or 50 billion US dollars, according to different sources, and the world stock markets tumbled. A trade war, however, may not be as close as previously expected, as the two sides have seemed to sit down and talk. Chinese Vice Premier Liu He called on both sides to make joint efforts to maintain the stability of their trade relationship. Meanwhile, U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin said he's optimistic the two sides can reach an agreement that will revise the demand for tariffs on the Chinese goods. So is this latest announcement of new tariffs just a bluff on the part of the U.S. administration? How will the two sides sort out their differences? Joining me from Geneva is Xiankun, Emeritus Professor at the University of International Business and Economics and at Wuhan University. Here in the studio, Mr. David Mahon, Managing Director at Mahon China Investment Management Limited. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Professor Xiankun in Geneva, let me come to you first. On this topic, Mnuchin said on Fox News that they're having very productive conversations with China, and he is cautiously hopeful that the two sides can reach an agreement. How optimistic are you about these talks? What can they be possibly talking at this moment?
I'm cautiously optimistic. I think the two giants have been showing each other too much muscles, and then now it's really a welcome signal to see that they put back their shirts and try to sit down to discuss. So that's, I think, a welcome signal for the whole world.
Yeah.
I think that this kind of conversation between the two sides will help each other to find solutions to whatever the difference is existing between the two sides. And I think a lot of things could be discussed, both on how to, what are the issues here and how to find the solutions, but more importantly, going beyond the economic and trade relationship, how to look deeper into the bilateral relationship and to find a new framework for the future relationship between the two giants, which will be important for not only themselves but also for the world. I think those are the things they need to discuss in these bilateral negotiations.
Right.
Thank you, Liu Xin.
Yeah, Mr. Mahon, however, looking at the long list of things the two sides can possibly talk about, where do you think the United States will start? I mean, we understand President Trump has said he wants China to reduce U.S. trade deficit by about $100 billion US dollars. So what will be the first thing they want from China?
Well, I think the trade deficit's a product of the different nature of both economies. America's had trade deficits for over 40 years, and actually the big deficits consolidated towards the end of the 90s, before China was really a major player. So there's a mismatch here. I mean, a lot of things which it says, America says it suffers from China selling to it, come through the investment that Southeast Asian countries have into the Chinese economy. If you look at the Apple situation, China takes about $25 in $800 iPhone. $400 goes to Apple, and then Foxconn from Taiwan, and South Korean interests and also Japanese interests take profit from the rest. So there's a mismatch. I think he's playing possibly for his midterm election in November, and being Trump, whose total focus is domestic, he's trying to galvanize a base that he's begun to see in some of the early indications might slip away from him. So I think this is much to do with domestic politics as it is the realities of imbalances of trade.
However, he has prided himself as being the candidate, as being the president who keeps his promise. So he wants to reduce this trade deficit, whether or not that is a reasonable demand. He seems to be determined to pursue that goal. So, Professor Liu, on the side of China, what will be China's solution for President Trump that, that bilateral trade will not be disrupted and President Trump can answer to his constituencies?
Yeah, I think that both sides should look at this issue in a positive manner, trying to resolve it by expanding bilateral trade instead of restricting it. I think, of course, on China's side, China is much different from 15 years or 20 years ago. It's much bigger and stronger, and its economy is growing, has global influence. So a lot of talks have been going on about China should further open its markets, including financial sector and others, which are important for U.S. and others. But those are also what China has committed to do. Recently, China has launched a few kind of measures to open its markets, including financial market, by allowing foreign online paying system to enter into Chinese market. Those are things that should be happening, and of course a lot more should be done. But of course this is more than just China, and on the U.S. side a lot of talks have also been going on, saying that U.S. should lift its restrictions on export of high technologies towards China. And of course recently there have been some movements on the U.S. side to restrict China's foreign investment in the U.S., which of course is not going into the right direction. So those are just examples to show that on both sides much more should be done.
Right.
And trying to help resolve this.
Of course, the options are many, according to the Chinese. However, let's talk about this lifting the restrictions on the export of high-end, high-tech products. Do you think the U.S. is ready to sell this kind of products, Mr. Mahon, to China, given that the U.S. is already worried about China being even more advanced in its technological development?
Well, if you think of America a couple of hundred years ago, they spent their time stealing from Britain its textile technology, and it helped kickstart their own industrial revolution. In the end, you can protect and hide your technology, but others will find ways to copy it or create it. I think it would be better for America to enter into a more integrated relationship with the Chinese economy on high technology, but also in the service sector. As Professor Liu just said, opening up the service sector will help gradually. It will help the Chinese service sector become stronger, and it would certainly make China a much more fluid negotiator with the rest of the global economy. There are issues here. There are restrictions which I think it is now time to change. If you think of Zhu Rongji's great move to join the WTO, that helped make the Chinese economy stronger because it was exposed to international competition. But I don't think we do have the minutiae of real discussions here. This, I think, is still political. And I wouldn't want to credit Trump and those around him with any great vision for rebalancing US-China trade. This is a demonstration of petulance in some ways. This is for the domestic economy. And unusually, they won't get support from Europe or Japan, which normally in these kind of spats they need, because they are both being marginalized by his moves to try and take a more nationalistic and protectionist position in the US.
So in this case, how can China react? Is China kind of forced or, I should say, leaving no choice but to appease the kind of political needs that President Trump is looking for? Professor Liu.
I think, of course, what Mr. Mahon has said is really the core of the issue here, that the both sides are looking at this differently and from different triangle. And that brings the key question about how to look into at the China-US relationship in the long term instead of kind of short-term electoral kind of interest there. So I think that would be the starting point. On the China side, of course, any concession unilateral concession would be seen by Chinese side as kind of appeasing. But on the other side, whatever China is going to do, including opening up its financial markets and other service markets, would be in the long term good for China's own benefits. This, of course, has been recognized by Chinese leaders and the industries themselves. So I think that we need to look at those things more comprehensively instead of just looking at who is paying more or who is paying less.
Mm-hmm. And also, how do you look at the kind of narrative that has been going out and quite consistent, actually, from President Trump and from his secretaries, talking about the kind of economic aggression by outside countries toward the United States, talking about the very different level of tariffs U.S. goods face when it enters other markets versus other products when they come into the United States markets. Mr. Mahon, how credible do you find those kind of narratives so far?
Well, I think there are issues about market openness, and that's an area that China needs to think about very carefully and to initiate and not be pushed to actually consider where it can prudently open the financial sector, maybe even something as extreme as the telecommunications sector. But ultimately, with two economies in such different stages of development, all the things that have been said about China robbing jobs from American workers, it's not true. American companies have been moving business away from its shores since the end of the Second World War. If you think of the huge move to places like Korea, Japan in the 50s and 60s, essentially the American economy is at a very different cycle. It's largely a service economy. Americans don't save. They borrow from the rest of the world to support their lifestyle. Chinese people do save. Americans have almost zero savings, 40% savings rates here. So in a sense, the kind of issues that need to be discussed are not ones that are being put forward by the US. I think China's responses have so far been pretty good. Firmness, but calm. You don't want to be the other person shouting when someone's shouting at you. It's kind of Tai Chi approach, which I do believe has been an aspect of this administration, certainly in the last 2 or 3 years. Mm-hmm. So there's good grounds for some steadiness here.
Professor Liu, I was talking to Pascal Lamy, the former Director General of the WTO, and he, while criticized President Trump on some of the biased or even downright false narratives, he did criticize for China for not having opened up fast enough and for forced technology transfer when foreign companies enter China and set up joint ventures. What is your comment on the part of things that China can do to really level the playing field?
Yeah, maybe before China, I think Pascal is right in saying that Trump has made a big mistake by resorting to unilateralism instead of multilateralism. Of course, on China's side, I mean, a lot of things have happened since China joined the WTO in 2001, and a lot of things have happened in opening China's market. But of course, China has grown much bigger, and on top of the WTO accession commitments, there are not much happening in opening further China's markets, especially in service sector. Of course, this is what China has recognized, and then China should do more for sure. But as I said before, that there needs to be a framework in which China could do so. I think the most ideal way is, of course, the multilateral platform through the WTO negotiations, but which for the moment is, of course, stalled, and then with reason from many, including the U.S. Bilaterally, China and the U.S. SED dialogue has been discontinued, which, of course, closed the door for another channel. I mean, G20, APEC, and there are plenty of platforms that China and the U.S. should work together in opening up further China's markets, but at the same time open their own markets towards China, including the investment. Mm-hmm. So I think those are the things we need a kind of sound, predictable framework in which China and the U.S. could interact in the long term.
However, we are not seeing the kind of atmosphere at this moment for constructive and long-term talks. Anyway, we have to leave it there. Many thanks to my two guests, Xiankun, Emeritus Professor at the University of International Business and Economics and of Wuhan University, and David Mahon, Managing Director at Mahon China Investment Management Limited. So you're watching The Point. We'll be back right after this short break. Stay with us. Russia and China are both trying to preserve their independent way of development while facing domestic and international challenges amid growing hostilities from the West. Looking ahead, how could the two countries better coordinate their policies to achieve mutually beneficial development and help shape a more equitable international order? What to expect from Sino-Russia relations in the next few years? For more insights, I talked in Moscow to Vasiliy Kashin, a senior research fellow from the Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies at the National Research University in Moscow. I started by asking him his views on the upcoming Shanghai Cooperation Summit, which will be held in Qingdao, eastern China, this June.
In the new summit, the relations between China and India will be increasingly important, and I think a lot of attention will be drawn to that. China and India had a number of difficult moments in their relations in the past months. For example, the situation on Maldives, and at the same time there are also positive trends in China-India relations. Recently there is renewed interest from both sides in dialogue and exchanges, so we can hope that this positive trend will be strengthened, because basically at this stage the ability of Shanghai Cooperation Organization to work mostly depends on the ability of China and India to sort out their differences.
What do you think of the relationship between China and Russia under the Shanghai Cooperation Organization framework? Anything new in there?
For us, Shanghai Cooperation Organization mostly remains a platform to talk about the regional security, and this dimension of our cooperation is developing well. I think there are no major changes in that. Of course, we have continuing dialogue between Eurasian Economic Union and China on a number of issues, and we have our trade agreement ready, so we are going forward, but mostly such activities are not happening in the framework of Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
How do you look at the effort to dovetail China's Belt and Road Initiative with Russia's Eurasian Economic Union? Do you see the ability of the two countries to confluent their policies so that these initiatives can coexist and serve both countries and the regions in Central Asia?
I think we already found some model of cooperation. We are moving forward in discussions on bilateral trade, because in every trade issue Eurasian Economic Union is acting as a single entity, and it's a single market, and I think there is certain complementarity between Russia and China in developing the regional economy, because China is strong in these capital-intensive big projects, but at the same time Russia is providing its access to the labor market of the region. It's vital for some of the regional countries. Russia is also key exporter of a number of goods and commodities to the Central Asian region, and I think we are not that concerned about possible competition. There used to be certain concerns, but it's more or less settled down now. I think the next stage would be deeper agreements about trade, investment and mutual opening of the markets. Eurasian Economic Union countries are especially interested in the Chinese market of agricultural products, food, and possibly some types of medicals, and that will allow us to diversify our trade and progress further.
Right. The Belt and Road Initiative is a very big initiative, but one of the pillars is infrastructure connectivity, and China has been pushing for such a development, and at the same time Russia, as President Putin said in his State of the Nation address, is also seeing great need for infrastructure development and regional development of cities and rural areas in the Far Eastern areas. What kind of opportunities do you think there are for the two countries to cooperate?
Of course, we do have a major program under discussion, which is a high-speed railroad to Kazan, which will initially go to Vladimir and then to Kazan, and maybe in future will be expanded. There is a significant need in additional roads and other transport and communication infrastructure in the Russian Far East, because we are increasing the exports of our commodities to the Asian countries, and the current capabilities are not adequate. Chinese companies are already participating in a major way in the development of the Russian Arctic, so we can move forward. Of course, we do face certain difficulties because of the economic war which is being conducted by the Western countries against Russia. The problem is that both our countries still depend on the Western financial infrastructure for international trade. So for many Chinese, especially private companies, it's difficult to trade with Russia. They're afraid that they can come under certain American punitive measures as a result. So I think to move forward, we'll need to develop some new kind of financial infrastructure which will be protected, because both our countries are likely to face increased pressure from the West in the future.
One more question about the economic relationship between the two countries. We have set a very ambitious goal of reaching bilateral trade to $200 billion by 2020, and yet right now we're standing at 80 billion, and we're just 1 or 2 years away from that target. So do you think we set the goal too high, or what has been the difficulty?
Well,
how to improve faster?
I think the goal was set before the commodities prices collapse and devaluation of ruble, which affected both Russian export to China and Chinese export to Russia. Of course, since most of the Russian export to China consists of commodities, the overall volume in financial terms is highly dependent on volatile markets. However, in the physical, the physical volume of our export in millions of tons continued to grow. I don't think we are likely to reach $200 billion by 2020. However, there will be significant growth in our export, because there will be additional shipments of oil because of the expansion of existing pipeline, and we hope that in 2019 the first natural gas pipeline will start operating. In general, our trade heavily depends on these large projects, like we build a new pipeline or a new road, and then we have a jump in our trade immediately.
Okay. Looking ahead in comprehensive scale, how do you look at the relationship between China and Russia in the next 5 years?
Now we have strengthening mutual dependence. China, for a number of years already, is the biggest trade partner for Russia if we consider the individual countries. Soon, at some point, it will become comparable to the whole European Union combined, at some point, probably in the next decade. At the same time, Russia became the largest supplier of oil to the Chinese market in the last years. I think we can hope that it will be increased, and I think the next stage, and something is being done already for this, is industrial cooperation, joint production chains, which will tie us even closer together.
Politically, how do you look at the picture?
A political side of our relations is, of course, better than economic one. Here we don't have this problems caused by the situation in the international market. We already had very close cooperation and very good personal relations between the leaders. Currently, both, not just Russia, but also China is facing increased pressure from the United States. We see that there is high possibility of trade war between China and the United States. Even if there is no real trade war, some prohibitive measures are already being taken. There is a certain negative dynamic in military situation in the region. So we will need to cooperate even closer, and if we look at the joint military exercises, we see that this cooperation in security is expanding. For example, last year, for the first time, the Chinese Navy participated in joint exercise with the Russian Navy in Baltic. So that was a big development.
Right. In terms of the Far Eastern region, we know President Trump has announced this meeting with Kim Jong-un, the leader of the DPRK. How do you look at that meeting?
As far as I understand, the agreement by the United States to hold this meeting is a significant success for North Korean diplomacy, because having direct meeting with US President was a long-term goal of North Korean foreign policy, and they wanted to do it directly, so they would in this way they would underline their complete independence from any other country, including China and Russia. I think there is a significant danger that the Americans will try to reach certain agreement without any participation from Russian or Chinese side, even in spite of the fact that in reality the broad principles and approaches to the agreement follow Russian and Chinese initiative of the double freeze. Basically, it's starting with North Koreans stopping any tests and then moving towards gradual resolution of the nuclear issue. I think we can avoid, I think anything which helps to avoid military conflict in the region is welcome. At the same time, we need to watch about subsequent American actions, because the result could be that US can decide that they don't need any more cooperation on North Korea, especially from China, and become even more aggressive and assertive.
Basically, this issue being used for geopolitical reasons. That was Vasiliy Kashin, a senior research fellow from the Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies at the National Research University in Moscow. And that is it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got the point.